A long time ago, there lived a king and queen who said every day, if only we had a child, but they never had one. But it happened that once, when the queen was bathing, a frog crept out of the water onto the land and said to her, "Your wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year has gone by, you shall have a daughter." What the frog had said came true, and the queen had a little girl who was so pretty that the king could not contain himself for joy and ordered a great feast. He invited not only his kindred, friends and acquaintances, but also the wise women, in order that they might be kind and well disposed towards the child. There were 13 of them in the kingdom, but as he had only 12 golden plates for them to eat out of, one of them had to be left at home. The feast was held with all manner of splendor, and when it came to an end, the wise women bestowed their magic gifts upon the baby. One gave virtue, another beauty, a third riches, and so on with everything in the world that one can wish for. When 11 of them had made their promises, suddenly the 13th came in. She wished to avenge herself for not having been invited, and without greeting or even looking at anyone, she cried with a loud voice, "The king's daughter shall in her 15th year prick herself with a spindle and fall down dead." And without saying a word more, she turned round and left the room. They were all shocked, but the 12th, whose good wish still remained unspoken, came forward. And as she could not undo the evil sentence, but only soften it, she said, "It shall not be death, but a deep sleep of 100 years into which the princess shall fall." The king, who would fain keep his dear child from the misfortune, gave orders that every spindle in the whole kingdom should be burnt. Meanwhile, the gifts of the wise women were plenteously fulfilled on the young girl, for she was so beautiful, modest, good-natured and wise that everyone who saw her was bound to love her. It happened that on the very day when she was 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home, and the maiden was left in the palace quite alone. So she went all round into all sorts of places, looked into rooms and bedchambers, just as she liked, and at last came to an old tower. She climbed up the narrow winding staircase and reached a little door. A rusty key was in the lock, and when she turned it, the door sprang open, and there in a little room sat an old woman with a spindle, busily spinning her flax. "Good day, old mother," said the king's daughter. "What are you doing there?" "I'm spinning," said the old woman, and nodded her head. "What sort of thing is that rattles around so merrily?" said the girl, and she took the spindle and wanted to spin too, but scarcely had she touched the spindle when the magic decree was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger. And in the very moment when she felt the prick, she fell down upon the bed that stood there and lay in a deep sleep. And this sleep extended over the whole palace. The king and queen, who had just come home and had entered the great hall, began to go to sleep, and the whole of the court with them. The horses, too, went to sleep in the stable, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons upon the roof, the flies on the wall. Even the fire that was flaming on the hearth became quiet and slept. The roast meat left off frizzling, and the cook, who was just going to pull the hair of the scullery boy because he had forgotten something, let him go, and he too went asleep. And the wind fell, and on the trees before the castle not a leaf moved again. But round the castle there began to grow a hedge of thorns, which every year became higher, and at last grew close up round the castle and all over it, so that there was nothing of it to be seen, not even the flag upon the roof. But the story of the beautiful sleeping briar rose, for so the princess was named, went about the country, so that from time to time kings' sons came and tried to get through the thorny hedge into the castle. But they found it impossible, for the thorns held fast together, as if they had hands, and the youths were caught in them, could not get loose again, and died a miserable death. After long, long years, the king's son came into that country and heard an old man talking about the thorn hedge, and heard that a castle was said to stand behind it, in which a wonderfully beautiful princess named Briar Rose had been asleep for 100 years, and that the king and queen and the whole court were asleep likewise. He had heard too from his grandfather that many kings' sons had already come, and had tried to get through the thorny hedge, but they remained sticking fast inside it and had died a pitiful death. And then the youth said, "I am not afraid. I will go and see the beautiful briar rose." The good old man might dissuade him as he would. He did not listen to his words. But by this time the 100 years had just passed, and the day had come when Briar Rose was to awake again. When the king's son came to the thorn hedge, it was nothing but large and beautiful flowers, which parted from each other of their own accord, and let him pass unhurt. Then they closed again behind him like a hedge. In the castle yard he saw the horses and the spotted hounds lying asleep. On the roof sat the pigeons with their heads under their wings. And when he entered the house, the flies were asleep upon the wall. The cook in the kitchen was still holding out his hand to seize the boy, and the maid was sitting by the black hen, which he was just going to pluck. He went on farther, and in the great hall he saw the whole of the court lying asleep, and up by the throne lay the king and queen. And then he went on still farther, and all was so quiet that a breath could be heard. And at last he came to the tower and opened the door into the little room where Briar Rose was sleeping. There she lay, so beautiful that he could not turn his eyes away, and he stooped down and gave her a kiss. And as soon as he kissed her, Briar Rose opened her eyes and awoke and looked at him quite sweetly. And then they went down together, and the king awoke, and the queen and the whole court looked at each other in great astonishment. And the horses in the courtyard stood up and shook themselves. The hounds jumped up and wagged their tails. The pigeons upon the roof pulled out their heads from under their wings, looked round, and flew into the open country. The flies on the wall crept again. The fire in the kitchen burned up and flickered and cooked the meat. The joint began to turn and sizzle again, and the cook gave the boy such a box on the ear that he screamed, and the maid finished plucking her fowl. And then the marriage of the king's son with Briar Rose was celebrated with all splendour, and they lived contented to the end of their days. Well, as Robin said, Claude Lévi-Strauss, a great French anthropologist, his major work were 4 volumes called Mythology, in which he analysed 1,000 myths from North and South America. And he came to an astonishing conclusion. The final chapter of the final volume is called One Myth Only. And he announced his discovery that all the world's magical myths and fairy tales amount to one myth only. That was the title of his chapter, One Myth Only. All these stories are variations on a theme. They're sort of the same story. They have the same underlying grammar, but they're, of course, variations on one another. And he was interested to just ponder, how come the entire planet is embraced by this myth, this web of mythology, all of which is like knitted together into one ultimate story? Where does that ultimate myth behind all the variations, where does it come from? And he had 2 basic theories. He wasn't sure which one was right. One is that the unity of all these myths stems from the way the brain is itself constructed. In other words, from the innate architecture of the brain of our species, Homo sapiens. So maybe there's something about our brain which, when it's left to itself just to dream about things, just comes up with stories which are so similar because they're just reflecting the way the brain's made. But he also had another theory, and that is that possibly the unity of all these myths around the planet is a reflection of history. Maybe they are kind of echoes. They're a great anonymous voice stretching back in time to the moment when our species emerged as a symbolic species, a language-speaking species. Maybe all these myths, one metaphor might be, they're a bit like the background radiation that was discovered in the 60s, which turned out to be, when it was analysed, this sort of constant hum. So whichever way your radio telescopes were pointing, they're picking up this strange humming sound. It turned out to be an echo of the Big Bang with which the entire universe began. And Lévi-Strauss's suggestion was that the world's fairy tales are a kind of echo of a different, not exactly a Big Bang, but some amazing event when human consciousness relatively suddenly emerged. Maybe these stories are a kind of echo of that moment, and maybe if we respect the stories and listen to them, we will pick up something about what it was that happened as we first became the symbolic species, as we first began using language, including, of course, the language of mythology. My inclination when I read all this in the 60s and got very excited by it all was to see if the theory which Lévi-Strauss had developed using the myths of North and South America, I was interested in. First of all, I thought, well, if he's right, it shouldn't just stop with the Pacific or the Atlantic. You know, you should be able to go to, say, Australia and pick up some Aboriginal Australian myths, and you should find the same basic myth there as well among the stories that Aboriginal Australians have been telling for hundreds and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years. But I also had the idea that if the theory was right, it ought to work right across the board. And why not look at some stories that we are familiar with here, our familiar fairy tales. Now, some of you will know that anthropology is the study of what it means to be human. And the crucial thing is to realize that the way we're human in this part of the world, in London, is one of many different ways. And the whole point of anthropology is to kind of get out of the shell of our own assumptions, the shell of our own culture, and see if we can find a window into other ways of being, other ways of seeing, other ways of respecting the sacred, other ways of bringing up children, other ways of arranging sexual relationships, other ways of organizing politics, and there are so many different ways there are of being human, which are radically different from the way that we've ended up pursuing in this part of the world, the way which of course has now become pretty much dominant. But one of the windows into those other ways of being are myths and fairy tales. And this story, The Sleeping Beauty, is as good a window as any. And one of the reasons I like to begin the course on mythology at this evening class with this particular story is it's just so. First of all, most of you should know the story, I think, at least in outline. And secondly, somehow there's something about this particular story which, I don't know, you should be able to decode it yourselves. So what we sometimes do here in RAG, we have a workshop where you just tell each other the story. You follow Lévi-Strauss's instructions, which are to give full respect to the intelligence of this story. It may seem a little bit absurd in places. All of these stories are kind of collections of one absurdity after another from one standpoint, but Lévi-Strauss's method involved respecting the stories. So what we have done in the past is have a workshop when you yourselves try to work out what the story must be all about. But because we're in this lecture theatre, it's a little bit difficult to organise little tables all separately, which we used to be able to do. So I'm going to deal with all of this in a slightly different way, but I still want to kind of use the same basic method. And what I want to do is to start with kind of the key motif. Supposing you forgot nearly all the story, or couldn't quite remember it all, but you had one image in your mind which sort of summed up the story of Little Brow Rose. And when I ask this question, a lot of you tend to say, well, it's the kiss, the end of the story, boy meets girl, kisses her on the cheek, she wakes up from a long sleep, and they get married and they live happily ever after. The trouble is that nearly all the stories end that way, kind of in that way. And to pick out this particular story, maybe there's another sort of striking motif which sort of hits you between the eyes and which sums up the whole, the whole narrative. And usually, most of you say, right, it's Beauty. She's 15 years old. She's met her fairy godmother, or witch, the 13th fairy, the 13th wise woman, who's spinning, 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 and Beauty reaches her hand out and pricks her finger. And when she pricks her finger, she falls down dead. And that 100-year death, initially, of course, intended to be a permanent death, afflicts the entire kingdom. And so the issue there would be, right, okay, if the story knows what it's doing, if the story kind of has got some intellectual consistency to it, it should be that when we decode that motif, girl of 15, pricks a finger and bleeds, once we've worked out, well, what could that possibly be about? It should start to unravel the entire story. It should all begin to make sense. maybe I'll ask you if anyone's got any idea. Girl of 15 pricks a finger, bleeds. I mean, these stories, they use metaphor, of course, and including euphemisms. That sometimes there are sort of secret knowledge, secret elements which can't be spoken about too glibly, and so they're kind of wrapped up a bit. But I think I've already got a hand out. It's very, very good. Hello, hi, yes. Yeah, that's right. I mean, is that what everyone was going to say? I mean, I just think it's a complete no-brainer that girl comes of age, 15, and bleeds. It's menstruation. And you might say, well, in that case, why doesn't it made a bit more explicit? My view is it's made pretty explicit. But of course, we also are aware that in patriarchal cultures, including our own, I would say particularly our own, the whole topic of menstruation is pretty taboo. It's actually difficult for me, an anthropologist, to talk about menstruation without almost asking permission to be able to do so. It's such a deep taboo. And although all cultures have something like a taboo, the cultures that we study here mostly in the radical anthropology group, for example, the Hadza, that I've visited along with some other colleagues doing field work, in hunter-gatherer societies, there is a taboo on menstruation, but it's kind of open. Everyone knows about menstruation. It's taboo in certain senses, but it's not a ruthlessly internalized secret that no one's allowed to talk about. In fact, the main source of ritual prohibitions on different kinds of meat and sort of prohibitions governing the way in which kinship structures are organized is actually menstrual blood. Whereas here in the West, the taboo is so internalized that even scientists find it difficult to talk about it, rather weirdly in my view, but of course we have to recognize, don't we, that our major universities in this country were once, not so long ago actually, Oxford, Cambridge and so on, they were theological colleges, and I think we all know that the Christians have always had a bit of a problem with women. I would say probably with two things. Women is one big problem for Christians. Not just Christians, of course. All the world's patriarchal religions have got a problem with women. So it's not just Christianity, it's Judaism and Islam and so many other religions. But they've also got a problem with something else, and that's the moon. And as a result of that, of course, the very word for madness is intimately connected, of course, with the moon. So lunacy, moonshine, all these words. The patriarchy has managed to make any interest in the moon, any cultural interest in the moon, like a sign of something wrong with you. You're probably a woman, but if you're not a woman, it's even worse. You've got other reasons for being a little bit suspect. So all I'm saying is that there are these taboos, and the fairy tales. I mean, what we have to recognise that these stories, the Grimm's fairy stories, but of course all the other fairy stories, Robbie mentioned a word for them, it's old wives' tales. And the astonishing thing is that these tales have survived an extraordinary period of censorship in Europe, obviously the Inquisition. And these are stories kept alive, kept passing down through the generations by, yes, old wives, wise women, midwives and others, often called witches, of course, who, as we all know, on far too many occasions, burnt at the stake or otherwise drowned or otherwise punished for being wise women. And somehow they've managed to keep these stories alive through those periods of censorship. But in order to survive, the stories had to kind of shield themselves. And what you'll notice is in the stories, it was like, you could argue, you could accept from the story, yes, a woman can be very, very powerful. But if she was very, very powerful, she was certainly a witch. And so as long as you say, yes, she's a very, very, very wicked witch, somehow the enormous power of the woman can be transmitted. So there's something about the way in which these stories have adjusted to the patriarchy that explains the euphemisms, the codifications of these stories. They need to say an active woman is wicked, 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 but an active man, of course, men should be active. And so, of course, one reading of this story is an extremely patriarchal reading, isn't it? You can say the meaning of this story is as follows. If you're a man, you need to get up and go, get on your horse, ride out into the deepest, most scary forest, and take out your sword. Doesn't matter what the danger. This terrible, frightening hedge of thorns. Just slash your sword, cut into it, and capture your maiden. If you're a woman, anything as active as that is not really required. The best thing to do is to lie on your back for 100 years and wait for some prince to rescue you and kiss you on your lips, and he'll wake you up. I mean, that is a reading of the story, which is quite widespread. When I was getting interested in these stories, there were many books which argued that these stories needed to be, you need to get rid of them. They're woman-hating. They're patriarchal ideology, and they need to be, banished really because of what the messages they convey. Lévi-Strauss is wonderfully enlightening about that. He basically says, don't worry too much about the meaning of the myth. What he meant by that is that the meaning will be whatever you, in your own culture, feel about the story and whatever it means to you, given your Christian, your whatever it is, your assumptions. But he says, beyond the cultural meaning, given the context in which you're hearing the story, there's something else more interesting, which is almost like a snowflake. These stories have a crystalline structure. You have to work out that structure. And if you delve deep enough into that structure, you'll find the structures of the different magical myths connecting up. And then when you try to work out what that means, it will take you outside of your culture, your particular culture, and it will take you somewhere else. And my argument is actually that when it takes you somewhere else, the meaning you'll extract from the story is probably the reverse of that simple patriarchal version. And the trouble with the patriarchal version, the idea that if you're a woman you need to lie back and you lie back and wait 100 years, and if you're a young man you need to take out your sword and go for it, fight for your maiden, for your girlfriend, your lover, your maiden. The trouble with that version is that it just doesn't explain the details. Why the frog? Why doesn't the king get his wife pregnant? Why did she have to get pregnant by a frog? It's a bit strange. What's going on with that ceremony? Why there are 13 wise women in the kingdom? 13. Why 13? Why does the king say, but I've only got 12 golden plates? So one of those 13 wise women, and don't forget the story doesn't say anything about her being a wicked witch. It says she was the 13th fairy. But she's only gets annoyed when she's not invited because there are not enough plates to go round. So why that detail? And there are so many details. What is it about when the king decides to get rid of all the instruments in the kingdom which might cause his daughter to bleed? As if he's saying, well, my daughter's not going to bleed. She's not going to prick her finger. I'm going to destroy every spindle in the kingdom. Kind of, why would a man do that? Even if he's a king, what's happening there? There are so many details in this story that need to be allowed to speak. And when the details are allowed to speak, they give you a rather different message. So, right. We've kind of, I think, suggested that the motif of the 15-year-old princess who pricks her finger is a reference to menstruation. If this myth is logical, if it's coherent, it won't hop about from one topic to another. The theme of menstruation will run through the story, and when we've cracked the code at that point, the pricking of the finger, we should begin to feel that the whole story is beginning to unravel, is beginning to mean something. So, we could start at the very beginning with the frog. I think let's start with what happens immediately after little Briar Rose is born. The king arranges for a ceremony, and in many versions, when people remember it, they think of this as a christening, as a name-giving ceremony. And the interesting thing is that little Briar Rose, it's not quite clear that she has a name. I mean, the Briar Rose is clearly the rose that, part of that great hedge of thorns. Briar Rose, it's not exactly certainly isn't a Christian name, and she doesn't have any other name. But let's just start with the fact there are 13 wise women in the kingdom. And there are only 12 golden plates because the king says so. So 13 versus 12. again, just think about that and see if that connects up with a theme of menstruation, which we've sort of provisionally, at any rate, we've agreed is maybe the meaning of that finger pricking motif. 13 wise women, 12 golden plates. Why 12 and 13? What's going on? What are the 13 of? But an alternative interpretation is that there are only 12 of. And why would the 12 version be the version promulgated by a king, whereas the 13 seems to be just wise women deciding on things? 13 versus 12, it's not difficult. It really isn't, yeah? Months, okay. So in a year, there are always 13 full moons, or maybe 13 new moons, dark moons. It's somewhere between 12 and 13, but you can't get rid of that 13th month on a lunar basis. Okay, so can you see what might be happening here? There's a struggle over who controls time. Is it 13 wise women, or is it the king with his 12 golden plates? Because of course we all know that in the West, and here and elsewhere for a very long time actually, we've decided the different branches of Christianity with all kinds of schisms and conflicts and horrible, horrendous disputes, of course, they've decided that there are only 12 months in a year. And if you think there are only 12 months of the year, you probably have a bit of a problem trying to remember how long each month is. We've got funny little rhymes. 30 days are September, April, June and November, all the rest are 31 excepting February clear, which has only 28 and 29 in each leap year. I mean, it is quite complicated, and you can see why there would have been lots of disagreements about it. Whereas if you're hunters and gatherers, you've got the moon. You don't need to calculate anything. Okay? So we do know that when the Christians arrived, they came with a calendar from Rome, and the patriarchal, the patriarchs, the Pope, had decided in a year there are 12 solar months, 12 months disconnected from the moon and attached to the sun in the sense they're attached to the solar year. So in that case, what are these 12 golden plates? 12 suns. Now if we work that part out, there are 12 suns, we should be able to work out what kind of metal the plates were made of when the 13 wise women, as was the tradition, came along to this feast and had a place for everyone. There would have been 13 what metal instead of gold? Silver. There are 13 moons, 13 silver plates. And it's not explicit here, but because each telling of the tale, the narrator remembers little bits, different bits, like I do when I give this talk, But as soon as you start to think about it, you just realize, well, of course, there must have been 13 wise women, and their method of regulating time or controlling time was using the moon and not the sun. And so they had not 12 golden plates, they had 13 silver plates, 13 moons. The moon is silver, isn't it? So it's kind of logical, isn't it? So now you should be beginning to get the hang of this. What seems to be going on is a conflict, and the conflict, you could simplify a little bit by saying it's between matriarchy and patriarchy, but the terms matriarchy and patriarchy are a little bit too clumsy, perhaps. There's a control over who controls time. Is it the wise women of the kingdom, of which there are 13, or is it this king with his newfangled notion, introducing Christianity, that there are only 12 gold plates, that the year is made up purely of 12 solar months? So we're beginning to get somewhere with this, but we can begin to move on a bit on that basis and ask what was happening when the 13 wise women were about to give all their gifts. And can you see that the gifts given by the first wise woman, the second, the third, the fourth, they're all blessings, aren't they? She will look absolutely beautiful. She will sing like a nightingale. She will dance so beautifully. And if you think about all those gifts, they're the gifts which, if a girl grew up to be 14, 15 and eligible, she would be the most wondrous, beautiful, gorgeous bride for any young man. They're all that kind of blessing, aren't they? It seems to me. And now we come to the paradox. There are only 12 golden plates. The 13th blessing from the most powerful of all the wise women. We know that she's so powerful that the 12th fairy can't undo the curse. She's the most powerful. Can you just think about it? What might be her blessing, the supreme blessing, had she not been denied? And it just goes right back again to where we started with the pricked finger, doesn't it? Because her blessing, it was turned into a curse, not just a curse, you could argue the curse. Why was the blessing turned into the curse? Because this supreme blessing, the blessing of fertility, was denied by the king. You shall not give my daughter this blessing. This is the sort of ultimate patriarchal taboo on that final blessing, and the story never says that it's a curse, really. It just says that she was denied, and of course we all know that when you come with a lot of love and needed to give a blessing, and it is rejected, it does turn into its opposite. So it's the curse, and the curse is, of course, that whatever the king says, he can burn as many spindles as he likes. Nature will take its course. That girl will come of age, and she will bleed. Not even a king, with all his legislation, with all the burnings of these sharp objects, not even a king can stop that from happening. And so, of course, the girl comes of age, the years pass, she reaches the age of 15, she's alone in the palace. King and queen don't seem to be there. She's exploring all the openings and crevices in the palace. She finds a half-open door. She wanders up the spiral staircase, and who does she meet at the top? Spinning, spinning, spinning. It's clearly the 13th fairy, the same wise woman, who gives her that blessing, but in a negative form. So what we know from anthropology, right around the world, and really right around the world, except in the West, where so many of these things have kind of disappeared, is that when a girl has her first period, it's an enormous event. It's her initiation. A girl in any African, for example, hunter-gatherer society, the most powerful ceremony of the whole community. This applies to the Kalahari Sun people. It applies to hunter-gatherers in Africa generally. Is a girl's first menstruation, the time when she is blessed by the moon, as they will say. So that's what happens. But the point is that when the girl is blessed by the moon, she's also secluded. There's a wonderful account in a book called The Forest People by Colin Turnbull, who describes what's called the Alima ceremony. And in this description, what happened was that two girls came of age simultaneously. So they bled in synchrony with each other, and this was regarded as the most astonishing, wonderful occasion, the most joyful occasion of the whole calendar, and that both girls were placed in this. They built a special hut called the Alima. It's a large communal. You could call it a menstrual hut, but it's kind of the opposite of your image of the menstrual hut, because it's a communal dwelling. It's a place of celebration. It's the nearest these people, the Bambuti and Pygmy people of the Mbuti forest. The nearest they get to a church. They don't have churches, of course, but the nearest they get to a church is this special grass, large house into which the girls are placed along with their sisters and cousins and mothers and other female relatives, and they sing and they sing and they sing and they sing joyfully because their sister or daughter has been blessed by the moon. And what they're doing is they're learning about the secrets of life, if you like, and in particular the girls are learning about boys and what boys are and how to cope with them. And what happens is that now and again, well, first of all the boys in the neighbourhood come around this Alima house to see if they can catch a glimpse of the girls who've just recently come into circulation by coming of age. But what the girls do is they plot among themselves. And the girls have these saplings, these bendy saplings, kind of whips. And every now and again, the girls would all burst out of the Elima house and chase the boys. And the boys sort of run in terror from the girls. But if a girl manages to playfully tap one of the boys, he's under obligation now to visit the girls in the Elima house. And he has an experience. Basically, he gets jumped on by all the women. And his initiation is kind of that. His first introduction to sex is in this dark hut with all these women sort of jumping on him. And I imagine you could see what a rather different kind of initiation rite that is from some of the patriarchal assumptions about a boy's first sexual conquest. I mean, really, he's the one being kind of enjoyed. And the boys are actually quite frightened of this experience. They kind of run quite fast to avoid having to go into the Elima house. The point I'm making, though, is that menstruation means seclusion. So it means a separation between the girls and the boys, a separation between the two gender camps. And while the girls are bleeding, in all these societies, hunter-gatherer societies around the world, other taboos are observed. So, and there's no cooking, for example. While the blood is flowing, no one's cooking any meat. There are no fires being lit. There's lots and lots of sound, lots and lots of singing. But other activities are just taboo until the period of seclusion is over, in which case other things can happen. Meat can get cooked. Boys can come back from the forest with animals to cook and eat. Feasting takes place, and marital sexual relations can occur. But while the blood is flowing, all those things would be absolutely forbidden. The reason being that if you broke those taboos and had marital sex while that was going on, or started cooking meat and eating roast meat while that was going on, this would destroy the magical potency of the blood. So let's get back to the story. What I've just described with the Bambuti is the two girls bleed together and they go into this Elima house, and there's a kind of spell, a kind of magic spell cast across the hunter-gatherer camp. A joyful occasion, but it's also magical, and as I say, a kind of spell has been cast on certain types of activity. So in this story, whatever her father, the king, has done and said won't happen. He can't stop it. He can't stop her meeting her wise woman, her godmother, and bleeding. And of course, the spell is cast. And menstrual seclusion in hunter-gatherer and other traditional societies, it is a kind of death. It's a re-entry into the womb. So you get when you go into this house, it's dark, you smell the blood, you're intimate in a very profound way. It's almost as if you're back in the womb, which means you're kind of dead, but it's perhaps put it this way: if you, supposing you are dead, and you start to sort of feel a few things, and you're in the grave, you're dead, but you begin to feel a sort of pulse, a heartbeat, and you begin to feel it's quite warm in there. And after a while, you begin to feel there's some other things going on which are quite interesting. But the point is that if this death is like womb death, if you're in the womb, the next stage is you come out of the womb, you've been born. And in all these cultures where female initiation takes the form I've just described, briefly using the Bambuti as an example, what happens is that you die temporarily. It's a temporary death. So you die in the way the moon does. You die, but you come alive again. And when you come out of that experience of initiation, you're born again. You're reborn. Okay? Now, in this story, the king has decided he doesn't want all that. He's decided he doesn't want his daughter to die at all, to bleed at all. My daughter shall not bleed is basically what he's legislating. And so can you see, from the point of view of the wise women, and particularly the 13th woman, she's meting out a kind of punishment to the king. You think your daughter won't die, a temporary death from which she will emerge with the blessing I came to give. The punishment for that will be that she dies and stays dead. So that's the curse, that she will click a finger, die, and remain dead for all eternity, in the way death is forever, of course. But the 12th fairy, when she's asked to lift that death sentence, she says, I can't, but I can commute it. Instead of dying forever, she will only die for 100 years. But of course, the assembled notaries, the king, and all the nobles, and in the palace, they're not happy about this. They say, "Oh, she'll only be there for 100 years." They don't, the decision is she shouldn't die at all. But I want you to see that the story is telling us that there's no way around this. That if you try and prevent that kind of temporary death or moon death, the result will be death of the wrong sort, the permanent kind. So she bleeds, and the spell is cast, and everyone's under that spell, and all activities, all normal domestic activities, all cooking, all scullery work, all the different things which make up normal activities are halted. One of the ways in which we can think about this pattern, which happens in traditional cultures, where women bleed in that powerful way, is to think about menstruation in terms of its periodicity. Now, next week here at RAG, Camilla Power will be giving a lecture called Why Menstruation Matters. And among other things, Camilla is a biological anthropologist, and she will be doing a lot about the biology of menstruation. One of the things about the menstrual cycle, I don't really need to tell you this, you probably all of you kind of know, but somehow it doesn't get talked about in scientific circles as much as it should do. I mean, for example, if you look at stories of human origins, and all the textbooks about human origins, it's not just that menstruation doesn't occur in those textbooks, it's that women aren't seen. You don't even see women. You see man the hunter, man the toolmaker, man the thinker, man this and the other. Not even women appear independently in any of these stories of origin, and these are Western scientific stories. Menstruation certainly doesn't appear. But actually menstruation is particularly interesting in the case of our species. Because although we're quite closely related to, say, common chimpanzees, or bonobos and other species of chimpanzee, the average length of a bonobo menstrual cycle is 40 days. The average length of a chimpanzee menstrual cycle is 36 days. Gibbons, it's about 28 days. Orangutans have a cycle of about 29 days. Now, of course, everybody knows that the menstrual cycle fluctuates. So in the human case, it's not too different in other primates. In the human case, when you're in your teens, your menstrual cycle is about 30, maybe 31 days. When you're in the most likely fertile period of life, late teens, early 20s, it's about 29.5. And then later on in the 30s, it starts to speed up. And it speeds up quite a lot, of course, before menopause. But the crucial thing is that the average length of menstrual cycle comes out as 29.5 days. And Camilla, who's speaking next week, will probably be mentioning the fact that now that we've got menstrual apps, you can actually quite quickly record your cycles using these complicated apps. It's come out as exactly 29.5 days. The average length, I mean, as I said, of course, it varies with age, but the crucial point is that at the time of maximum fertility, it's 29.5 days. Well, what is it about 29.5 days? How long does the moon take to pass through its phases as seen from the Earth? 29.5 days. So, when I give this talk at scientific conferences, all my sort of friends, they just say, "Oh, Chris, don't worry about it. It's just a coincidence." And yeah, I agree, it could be just a coincidence. But before you dismiss it as an irrelevant matter of chance, just a coincidence, why not explore whether there might not have been an adaptive reason in the evolutionary past why our species, different from common chimps, might have evolved a length of cycle precisely compatible with synchronizing one's cycles using the moon as a natural clock. Okay? First of all, explore. There might be a reason. If there isn't a reason, then it's just a coincidence. Actually, there are plenty of reasons. And I'm going to meander a little bit from the story before coming back to the story in a moment, because it's about these two things which, as I mentioned earlier, the theologians were worried about, one being women and the other being the moon. The moon is actually very important as a clock for the whole history of life on Earth, by the way. I mean, there wouldn't be life on Earth without this very strange moon that we have. Does everyone know all about this? How 4.5 billion years ago another planet hit this planet soon after it got formed, and it hit it at exactly the right angle, at the right speed for it to spin in a certain direction, and I mean, you know, and melt again, and I don't know, so many have a stable tilt of exactly so many things about this extremely unusual event, this particular collision, are responsible for the fact we've even got life on Earth, including the continental drift, the tides, the seasons, and so many other things. But getting closer to home, two facts. First of all, the very fact that we humans, let's say evolving humans, let's say hominins going back 3-4 million years ago, the very fact that we're such a social species, the very fact that we humans live in relatively large, relatively compact groups, is because of the moon. And to explain this, I've got to just say a little bit about this. What we've found out recently in the last 10-15 years using night vision cameras is the degree to which lions' night vision is just astonishing. So lions have amazing night vision, they can see in the dark, and lions, if it's a dark time of the month and in the dark time of the night, lions would even attack an elephant and clamber on top of it. They wouldn't dream of doing it if the elephant could see what's attacking them and, you know, toss them around. But there are plenty of pictures been taken, videos been taken of lions attacking elephants. Perhaps more significant from our point of view is it's been discovered. This is a paper by Craig Packer, the great lion expert working in Tanzania for many years. He did a record. The paper is easy to find. It's called Fear of Darkness. And a long list of authors, but you can easily find it on the web. What he found was that taking records of incidents in Tanzania during which human beings, often like goat herds and people out at night in rural areas, have been killed by a lion and eaten by the lion. It correlates with the moon. So it goes up and down like this: full moon, dark moon, full moon, dark moon. And some of the equipment that Packer and his colleagues have used, you can just shine a laser on the lion's tummy and see how big it is, and it swells and contracts, swells and contracts to a lunar rhythm. The lions can't be bothered to hunt if they can be seen. The lions are lazy creatures. They don't like running far. They much prefer to just eat you, or without having to move much. What happens is that because of that, they get very hungry around full moon, because around full moon they can be seen. Mostly the animals they try to catch, or the humans, have seen them and scamper up a tree or run fast. And they, as I say, lions don't like running far. But at dark moon, they're fine. But what happens is that because they're particularly hungry over full moon, what happens on the night immediately following full moon? Well, the night immediately following full moon, the sun sets. And in Africa, Tanzania, Central Africa, as soon as it sets, there's no twilight, the sun sets and it's dark. You've got 40 minutes of almost complete darkness before the moon starts to rise. This is the night after full moon. In that period of darkness following sunset is when the maximum danger is for human beings, partly because the humans have been fairly relaxed the last few nights, because as soon as the sun sets, the moon rises. So that, you can just carry on with your romance, your activities, dancing and singing and all sorts of things that people do, partying until quite late in the evening. But if you carry on the next night, the sun sets and you're still feeling a bit relaxed and stuff, and it might be a young man looking for romance across a few miles away, and okay, you're the lion's supper. You didn't see it. That's the great peak. Well, we humans co-evolved with lions. The reason we're sociable is because this is going right back 3 or 4 million years ago, hominins about this big. We came out from the forest. I'm really oversimplifying. It wasn't just we came out from the forest. What happens is the climate became drier. A lot of the dense rainforest became more like clumped woodland with lakes and sort of what's called savanna mosaic. So we were rather like bush chimpanzees have adapted to this mixed environment. The main point to say is that in the forest there aren't any lions. and you sleep in trees. You come out of the forest and you need to survive. The way to survive is safety in numbers. So what I think most of us agree, but certainly Jerome Lewis and I, and the articles we've written about all this, we found safety in numbers, but above all we used sound. So we sang all through the night when the night was dark, at the dark time of the month, to indicate to the lions, through constant nocturnal singing, don't mess with us, there's lots of us and we're well organised. So this singing, which happens in Africa among hunters and gatherers, particularly at dark moon, is actually, the women say, I'm now quoting from Jerome Lewis's work with the Mbengeli, that when you ask the women at dark moon, and they call the ritual at dark moon Malobe, why do you sing all night? Do you know what the women say? We're singing for our lives. We're singing to keep danger away. So every time in the moon's dark, people come together in compact groups and they sing to keep safe, because the lions don't want to mess with a bunch of people who are obviously well organised and got all their solidarity as expressed in their communal, polyphonic, as it happens, of singing, the kind of thing designed to convey an impression of large numbers of people. But at full moon, everyone can be more relaxed. So what I want you to get is the idea that dark moon, because of the lions, everyone's compact, full moon, separate. Okay, like a wave pulse. So it's like a pulse, a periodicity. And you can see, can't you, that if in that period, way back, talking about Australopithecines beginning to move, get a larger brain, walk on two legs, all sorts of things happening, a young, I won't say ape man, but anyway, a young hominid male wanting romance, he's not going to be travelling around looking for romance around the dark moon because he'd get eaten. He's going to choose the time of full moon when he's safe, making it logical for ovulation to occur around the same period, around full moon. And it is a fact, and we're getting back to fairy tales now, that around the world, in all the world's love songs, all the fairy tales, all the little nursery rhymes, boys and girls come out to play, the moon does shine as bright as day, the moon in June. I mean, is there a pop song which doesn't mention the moon at some point in the course of the sweetness and love? And it's always a full moon. I mean, if it's a dark moon, it's something wrong. Dark moon is a time for witches, for blood. Full moon is a time for honey. And of course, the very word honeymoon, we're going on a honeymoon, links to that idea. You have your honeymoon when the moon's full, and you're ideally, according to this ancient traditions, you're ovulating and not menstruating. You don't want to be menstruating on your honeymoon. Where's this all got me? Okay, that's one reason why the moon is important, or was important in our evolution. And of course, if women are synchronizing with each other using the moon as their clock, that in turn is going to be having effects. So, I mean, Robin mentioned my work on human origins, which I've been doing over the last, partly here, but other places for the last few decades. There's a kind of development, which is that at a certain, I have to cut corners here, otherwise this lecture will be far too long, and Camilla will cover some of it next week. What happened was that at a certain point in evolution, women living in relatively large groups, seeking safety in numbers, needing therefore to give birth to babies with brains sufficiently large and complex to be able to cope with the social complexities, women began to get help from each other in childcare. This is called Sarah Hrdy is a very influential these days evolutionary anthropologist. In 2010 she published a wonderful book called Mothers and Others. And the theory is, this is still relevant, you might wonder why I'm wandering around a little bit here, the theory is, it's kind of the usual theory that the thing which humans were great at is cooperation. But her theory is that for the moment, forget cooperation in the hunt. That is important, but it's not the first thing which happens. The first thing which happens is cooperation in the most demanding kind of activity you can imagine that humans ever have to face, which is childcare. So women needed to start supporting each other in childcare because as their brains were getting larger, for reasons of pressure for social intelligence, those larger brain babies were slower to mature, more demanding of high quality food, took longer to become independent, and so the childcare burdens were increasing, and the way in which evolving human females cope with those childcare burdens was sharing. And the first thing women started doing was living with mum. So you'd live with your mum, because of all the potential childcarers you can think of, your mum is the most reliable. You might think that's normal, living with mum. In some ways, obviously, it's not normal for us, really. You know, most men, when they get married, they want their wife to be as far as possible away from the mother-in-law. But living with mum is also unusual in terms of the great apes. So what happens with great apes, our closest primate relatives, is that when a female chimpanzee becomes mature and starts getting interested in sex, she has to move out from her territory, move into a place where she doesn't have any relatives, and then when she does have a baby, she's a single mum. She dare not give that baby to anybody else for fear of infanticide. So in the course of human evolution, for the evolving human female to switch over from this what's called male philopatry, or if you like, patrilocality, to matrilocality, or female philopatry, in other words, women staying with mum over the generations, that was a revolutionary development, staying with mum, because if you're staying with mum, not only have you got mum's support in childcare, you've probably also got sisters, and your sisters will be able to share that childcare as well. What then began to happen was the most amazing thing of all, which is that women, in the course of sharing childcare, evolving with the moon as the clock, synchronizing cycles, if not always perfectly, at least in terms of behavior and dance and ritual, women managed to do the most amazing thing, which is to get men, if you like, to get the leisure sex to play a part as well. So just to say that with gorillas, with chimpanzees, with other non-human primates, the male is, I won't say useless. The female needs his sperm to get pregnant with, but apart from that, kind of, you know, the male may keep an eye, of course, on his offspring. As part, like a gorilla, a male gorilla will quite anxiously look after his whole harem, doesn't want anyone else to take the harem from him, and he will be solicitous, caring towards the babies that he thinks are probably his. But there's no way a male gorilla or chimpanzee will be going away and getting food and bringing it back for wife and the kids. But with the course of human evolution, I'm just getting to the end of this section of the talk, there came a time when the burdens of childcare were so great, but also the opportunities to solve the problems of provisioning was so rapidly changing, that the females could draw on their solidarity, their childcare solidarity, for yet another purpose. And that's to make males help. So once males are two-legged, once you've got bipedal hominins, there's at least a potential for the males to go away, find some food, maybe some animals, small animals, maybe later on bigger animals, and bring back the meat to camp. And the way in which females did that, according to at least my own theory, but it's now kind of being debated, and there's plenty of support for it, because it's actually what happens with African hunter-gatherers to this day. It's called bride service. Women don't just allow sex to any old man that comes up asking for sex. Basically, the idea is women have a lot of solidarity, and a young man who wants sex, and young men often do want sex, he's got to earn it. And so essentially the women will say, you call yourself a hunter, okay, well, we like sex as well, you like sex, but on the other hand, go away, make yourself useful, maybe these days in Africa, go away and find a zebra, come back with it in a few days' time, around full moon, and we'll think about it. So that's called bride service, which means that a man never actually marries a woman. What you have is like a relationship, which is kind of legalized, I suppose you could argue, in the sense that it's collectively endorsed, but it's an endless negotiation, and the negotiations never end. At no point does a young man or an older man have the right to say, right, you're my wife, therefore you've got to give me sex. He's got to keep on proving his usefulness. And a man who ends up being, being told that he's lazy or selfish, he'll find himself out on his neck. Go back to your mum if you want meals. You're not getting anything around here, kind of thing. And that's usually called bride service. And that's the fundamental economic institution of hunter-gatherer society. Bride service means that men have to provide for their I use the word wife, but it's not really the right word, but men have to provide for their bride and her relatives as a condition of sexual access. And at any time, the women can decide collectively no. And the time to signal no wouldn't be around ovulation, it would be around the time when the women are gathering together, around the dark moon, around the time of menstruation, and no is not a message which you can just give like on your own. A woman just says no to a man. Well, he might think, well, okay, I'm very mobile, I'll go and find somebody who's saying yes. That whole idea of signaling no, which is just as important, of course, as signaling yes, that can only work if the women have got their solidarity. And my argument is that that solidarity ends up in a kind of strike action, kind of sex strike. Women have to say no collectively, together, using their blood as the symbol, we are sacred, we are taboo. And if women are in different regions of the landscape are all out of sync with each other, that won't work. So this strike, which I call a sex strike, would have to be kind of a general strike. And it's only going to work across the landscape if your general strike is synchronized to a clock, which is also across the landscape. So the obvious thing to do is to maintain the synchrony which has been part of the menstrual cycle evolving in the human species all along, and have your honeymoon at full moon and your sex strike at dark moon. I mean, that's a little bit over brief, and you may be rather shocked by this whole theory, because what it says is that things like the incest taboo and things like sexual morality and all human kinship systems, at the deepest root, the rules of all these complicated kinship systems around the world, at the deepest root, they're about sex. And there are theories, like Claude Lévi-Strauss, by the way. Claude Lévi-Strauss thinks men invented the incest taboo. It's not very likely. I won't go into it in any great detail, but the point about the male thinking purely biologically is that even if there are some genetic problems with having sex with your sister, the point about it is that the male can always have sex with somebody else. Whereas if you are the sister, you're pregnant with that baby. It will be the female of the species that resists that. And I mean, that's just one of many reasons for thinking that Lévi-Strauss is completely upside down, got it all completely wrong. The emergence of sexual rules of conduct, sexual morality, if you like. I mean, all human cultures have this thing called sexual morality. It involves embarrassment, shame, clothing, modesty, all these things. Have you ever seen a modest chimpanzee, a modest gorilla? I mean, this is a peculiarly human thing that we're kind of worried about sex. But we're worried about sex for very good reasons, profoundly valid reasons. And it would have certainly been female strategies which imposed upon males limitations on sexual availability, time, place, and other things. Don't have sex with your sister, keep clear of your mother-in-law, all those different rules which are part of kinship systems around the world. Let's get back to the story. Where is the picket line in this story? I've said that the way in which hunter-gatherer women motivated males to go hunting was by making sex dependent on it. That meant signaling no from time to time, as well as signaling yes in sexual terms. That meant forming a picket line. I mean, I've been on lots of picket lines. There's going to be a picket line here, apparently. All the workers at the UCL are going to be going on strike shortly against exploitation, using their campaign against outsourcing. But anyone that's been in a trade union and been on strike knows that what you do is you form a picket line. Am I right? So this would, unless you think that sex strike is different, that would mean that women form some kind of, have some kind of solidarity and display that solidarity in terms of getting males to behave and not just think that they can have sex because they want it. Where's the picket line in the story? I mean, maybe there isn't one. Sorry, somebody said something. Great.
Sorry. Was it the thorns?
Yes, you have a huge hedge of thorns, a great hedge of thorns. Do not cross this hedge of thorns. The wise women have established this for a reason. Any young man that thinks he can just take out his sword and hack his way through. When Camilla gives this story and describes it, she was as a bit of a feminist, Camilla has a little bit too much relish describing the way in which this hedge of thorns over the years, as the years go by, you've got these skeletons with little bits of flesh on, all sort of getting whiter and whiter, impaled in different parts of this hedge. The message being, don't mess with the witches. Do not, never cross a picket line if you like. So these young men coming along, and they just think they can, it's just a hedge of thorns. But can you just see what that hedge of thorns is? It's like amplified version of the prickliness, if you like, that got the little briar rose to bleed in the first place. She was pricked, and now there's a huge lot of prickly thorns around, forming a ring around the entire castle. And then, of course, what's happening during that period is that everyone is on not just any old local strike. I think it's detailed beautifully. I mean, all the flunkies are all frozen in their positions. The horses are all still. The cook is about to hit the scullery boy, and he's frozen. The flies all plop onto the flagstones. I mean, this is not just any old strike. This is a general strike. The entire kingdom is not working, and it stays out on strike for a rather long time. It seems like 100 years was necessary to get the message across. And it's synchronized with the bleeding, which we've already said is the menstruation of that royal figure. One of the things which got me onto the track of these stories, and many others, of course, was a wonderful description of what happens, and this is in the book called Blood Magic, where I have a chapter. You can easily get hold of that book as well. I think it was published in 1986. It describes traditional life among the North American Indians along the Yurok River, the Yurok. And the anthropologist, Tim Buckley, who I corresponded with for a period, he described visiting the Yurok Indians. And in the period he was visiting them, they were involved in a revival movement, remembering their old traditions. And when he arrived at this couple's bungalow, the man informed him that my wife is on her moon time, and her moon time lasts 10 days. So the whole house was divided into two, and the woman was in her section of the house. And a man, because they tried to go back to their old traditions, explained that he had to do all the cooking because his wife was on strike. Cooking strike, sex strike, the whole lot. And it turned out when Tim Buckley asked the woman later on to explain why she was doing that, she said, well, in the old times, until about 1900, all of the cycling women, all of the fertile women, all the women who were having their cycles would synchronize their cycles, and every new moon they would go up into what they call a sacred moontime pond and perform bathing rituals. And they'd come back and they'd dive down into this pond and come back with certain shells, symbolic of the womb and symbolic of fertility, sort of magical shells. And having been away from their husbands for 10 whole days, their husbands were really pleased to see them. And there was a great celebration and a lot of lovemaking, because, of course, you can get a bit bored with your partner if you've got them all the time, but if the women once a month are away for 10 whole days, it makes coming together special. And of course, in particular, it makes the gift of your body in sex a gift, where you can sort of see, can't you, I think, that if you're married and your guy owns you anyway and he's got a right to your body, it's a bit hard to make a gift when you kind of already gave that gift a long time ago, the day you got married. And of course, patriarchal marriage, Christian marriage, traditionally means, of course, that once you've said yes to your husband, that's it. You can't say no. So you can't even have even the very concept of rape and marriage. That doesn't work because you said yes to all that time ago. Well, the Yurok are very different. That's what I'm saying. Traditionally, and so they had a memory of using the moon as their clock. And when a woman got slightly out of synchrony with her sisters, she ovulated a bit too soon or a bit too late, what they said was she would sit out in the full moon all night, talking to the moon, asking the moon to balance her. Okay, let's just get back to the story. The story ends with a young man finally making it. And it makes it clear that all those young men were royal. They were all different levels of royalty. Kind of in those days, probably everyone was royal in some sense, linked to some sort of royal family. but the main point is he's nothing special. He's not a special king's son. He's not he is the right man, young man, at the right place at the right time. Why is it the right time? Because the 100 years is up. It's as if the wise women themselves have decided, right, we've decided this spell is going to last 100 years. When we say we're ready, we will lift the spell and sex can be allowed. So he arrives at that moment, and what happens is that the thorns turn to flowers. Any Freudian can work out the imagery there. The thorns of blood turning into the lovely flowers. The way parts. He doesn't have to use his sword. He walks through the opening. He steps over all the servants and flunkies and footmen and cooks and stable boys. They're all snoring and fast asleep. He arrives at the bed where little Briar Rose is asleep. He leans over, and as he kisses her, she wakes up, and synchronously with her, everybody else in the kingdom wakes up. So it's a synchronized going asleep, a synchronized temporary death, but also a synchronized waking up of the entire kingdom. So everybody wakes up, and of course the wedding is arranged, a massive feast, and they all lived happily ever after. And just to end with, because this has been going on quite a long time now, this this talk, I'm aware. You might be interested in this little booklet. This is a few chapters from my PhD thesis, which I wrote here in UCL. I think submitted it in 1987, I think it was. Everything I've done here, including this brief talk, not too brief, but anyway, this talk has been based on Claude Lévi-Strauss's method. What Lévi-Strauss says is respect the stories. These are intelligent. They seem to be absurdities, but there's method in the madness. We need to respect them sufficiently, listen to them, in order to be able to really benefit from the crystallized, anonymous wisdom passed on down through all those ages, possibly since the beginning of historical time. Lévi-Strauss claims that there's one ultimate structure behind all these myths, and he puts it in different ways. In one version he talks about a struggle between earth and sky for the possession of fire. The whole of the third volume is very much about menstruation and the moon. One problem with Lévi-Strauss is that there are lots of problems. As you read through his 4 volumes, you get an impression that he's onto something. There's no question that behind all these myths is a consistent logic. He is right. There is ultimately one myth enveloping one magical myth. Obviously, there are all kinds of different stories which are not magical, but if you're talking about magic, enchantment, the kind of thing which happens to you when you get initiated and become an adult and entitled to sex, there's one underlying structure, he calls it, or logic. So let me just explain what it is. I'm slightly simplifying here, but the way I see it, especially with Little Red Riding Hood, Jack and the Beanstalk, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, The Shoes That Were Danced to Pieces, the Grimm's fairy tales, it's particularly clear. And it goes as follows. You start out with this world. So you're in this world, you can see where you're going, there's daylight, there's cooking, there's domestic activities, people are working, I don't know, marital sex probably happening every night and stuff. So this is just this world, the world we're familiar with. And then there's a strange thing happens. Often triggered by a flow of blood, but it could be something symbolic of that, like the red cap of Little Red Riding Hood. In Jack and the Beanstalk, he bleeds from the nose. In Cinderella, the sisters bleed from the heel. But anyway, what happens is you're in this world, then there's a flow of blood, and this triggers a movement into the world beyond, into the land of the dead. So now you're dead. And there's nothing magical about dying. You were alive, and now you're dead. And now comes the magic bit. You come back from the dead. You come back from the dead, which is that is magic. That is what the moon is believed to do each month. And women who are in tune with the moon, they die and they're reborn. They die and they are reborn. And you'll find, if you want to explore all this, you'll find that these stories, they in their different ways, they tell of the disaster which occurred at a certain moment in time when humanity lost touch with the moon. When we lost touch with the moon, when we got the wrong message, when we forgot how to do it, the disaster which occurred was that when we die, we stay dead. It shouldn't be like that. We should be able to die and come back to life.